the best way to go about it is some experimentation, some exploration. Don't overthink it. But I definitely see tremendous value in strategically applying essentialism.
Like in the early going, when Digible first started, before we even knew we were doing apartments, like we were definitely more of this, like, let's experiment, try different categories or what have you. And then we decided, yep, apartments is the way we want to go. And then we really narrowed our focus.
You could say takes a polar opposite approach and, encourages you to really think through as much as possible all your decisions so that you don't waste any of the precious time you have and that you can make the greatest contribution, in your life through focus and through kind of, I'll say, radical essentialism, which is instead of looking at, less choices and doing more, is you should actually be evaluating more and do less. Daniel Pink says one of the best things you can do for your organization and maybe for yourself, if you're an entrepreneur, but is to do audits of autonomy and flow. And so throughout the week, you can have those check-ins.
Welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. Nailed it. Thank you. I'm David.
I'm Reid.
Yeah. All right, Reid. Yesterday we were meeting with our now, I guess, standard monthly founders lunch, which I'm enjoying now that we've had 2 of them. So I'm glad we're going to keep that up. And we started a conversation that I thought would be really fun to continue here because we were wrapping up and we didn't have time to get into it. But obviously we've talked about on this pod before essentialism, and after we read that book, and then you were mentioning how you've become a recent, I don't know if I should say fan of Huberman, but how he was saying you lack control and how you should follow your interests and that type of thing. So why don't you do the setup there on like what what his topic was the other day, and then what I started to bring up with essentialism. We'll get into it.
Yeah, and for those that don't know the reference Huberman, that's Andrew Huberman, and he's a doctor of I think physiology out at Stanford. I believe that's correct. But he's got a podcast, the Huberman Lab, that my wife Miranda turned me on to. I think it started with sleep because I'm not always the best sleeper. So just trying to see if there's any tips or things that I could do to improve that. And then, that just the floodgates opened up as I looked through and scanned through all the different episodes. And another one that I know everyone struggles with from time to time is stress. And he had on another doctor. I won't now speculate what her doctorate was in. I'll just say in stress, but stress management. I'm kidding. But anyway, she just said one of the most important things that you can do, or advice she gives, especially to those that are suffering from chronic stress, is to adopt a radical acceptance, as she put it, of the reality of life, which she emphasized that reality is that we cannot control our future, and we cannot control our lives. Certainly, she's saying that, more kind of broad strokes, but it's just one of the things she pointed to as a common thread among all humans. It's just a matter of, what level of anxiety you have or stress related to that. So just not knowing even, an hour in front of you, much less a day, months, a year. And what really can paralyze somebody is when they start thinking, 10 years out. And so when she brought that up, Andrew Huberman said, yeah, I mean, I completely understand that. And, for me, that's why, it's so important that I explore and experiment, and am always kind of not optimizing per se, but just, moving from one adventure to the next, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think that's so important in finding happiness, de-stressing, which is so critical both to your physical and mental health. And so, in bringing that up, it's not that he's saying he's just, life is capricious and, fly by the seat of your pants, but, he definitely, I think was implying don't overthink, things too much. that's only going to create more stress and potentially slow you down in life, and you won't be happy. And you made the connection at lunch with God, what's his name that wrote Essentialism?
I don't remember.
All right, well, good. We both don't know, but anyways, you and I both read that book recently, and he take
Greg McCowan,
okay, McEwan,
McEwen.
yeah, McEwen, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, he you could say takes a polar opposite approach, and encourages you to really think through as much as possible all your decisions, so that you don't waste any of the precious time you have, and that you can make the greatest contribution in your life through focus and through kind of, I'll say, radical essentialism, which is, instead of looking at less choices, um, and doing more, like, is you should actually be evaluating more and do less. And that's the best way to approach life. And ultimately, he didn't make it as much about happiness as he did about the way to really contribute to the world, through your gift or gifts. So hopefully that's the tee up you were looking for, but definitely two very different perspectives. And I think it's interesting to, I don't know if it's a personal choice on, I mean, of course it is, but is there in between on that, or are you really, are most of us leaning one side of that spectrum, or the other?
It sort of I was smirking a little bit because I had breakfast with Chelsea's parents yesterday, our website product manager, and her dad Jordan was giving me advice actually that connects to this, where he was like, "Hey, don't overthink um, community service. Just like jump into it, do something to start filling your bucket, and you'll figure out what you end up liking." So he was just saying, don't overplan. I think he sees me as a planner, which in some respects I'm a planner, in other respects I'm like super, fly by the seat of my pants. So I think there is something to it, because obviously Chelsea tends to be more of a planner, right? Lurch on our, our CEO tends to be more of a planner. But then there's us, which I think we are. I almost think like you and I are more planning when it comes to like what direction are we going for 10 years versus like the next three steps. But wondering how that strikes you, and when you look at essentialism versus this, I was calling it Random Walk on Wall Street after the famous investment book that came out like 20 years ago. But that's how I think about your little summary of like, you can't control everything, so you need to just roll with it and follow your curiosity. But I'm gonna guess your nature, it has previously been more follow, I don't know, your interest at the time in experiment versus essentialism. But now how does it strike you? Should you be leaning a different direction, or do you take something from both?
I hope that I apply both of those. I don't think you have to choose. And I think it's better not to. So the one of the more common, I'll say, adages, that you hear and have been hearing for, well, as long as I can remember, is it's all about balance. And so I think these books really, I'll say, can't be successful if they don't take kind of hard positions. And for Huberman, it wasn't a book, but it was definitely a pretty clear position that he takes, and how he leads his life. But you know, I so I respect that, but I think that the best way to go about it is some experimentation, some exploration. Don't overthink it. But I definitely see tremendous value in strategically applying essentialism, or selectively, however you want to put that. But I think there's definitely times and moments that approach or philosophy can be super valuable. And it could be that it's more the macro stuff, and you take more of that kind of experimental, random walk. I think is how you put it, or how Huberman put it. But um, to kind of fill out the days, which still flies in the face of what McEwen was saying. But it's like, when I'm making bigger decisions, and that would include when we discuss which direction the company goes, that is when I think the essentialism is critical. It's so powerful, because we do have a lot of choices to make, and I think it's great to evaluate more, not less, and then really focus on a few things. So
Hmm.
Yeah, my goal is to apply some, a little of all that. And we've said this many times with all these books, that we've read since we started the company. There's so much advice, but there's also a lot of contradictions. And sometimes it feels like it's even within the same author, But typically it's more, that one author, and I would say even Simon Sinek, Adam Grant, have slightly
Hmm.
different schools of thought. And if you read enough of this stuff, you'll start to catch on to those, and you have to make decisions for yourself about how you're gonna hopefully borrow from both and find some balance in all that wisdom they throw down.
Yeah, well, that is super interesting because obviously, like Jim Collins, really promotes focus, and then and obviously that's a core value of us. But he's about flywheel finding, and then like the smack recipe where that way it contains you. So I think it's more of like what is the right, I guess, into the spectrum, because when you're, and maybe it's different based on either the activity or the company. Like in the early going, when Digible first started, before we even knew we were doing apartments, like we were definitely more of this, like let's experiment, try different categories or what have you. And then we decided, yep, apartments is the way we want to go. And then we really narrowed our focus, and that was maybe like 6 months in. And then since then, we've been like all in on the niche and trying to hold to it. But then, um, then there's all of these, folks that sort of like Innovator's Dilemma and what have you, that say like, hey, big companies stop taking risks. They just become really risk averse, and that's their downfall. So then there's the argument, when you're leading a big company, do you have something like a R&D department or a moonshot department, which Google, has their moonshot department, but then, they get criticized because they're going, like, it feels like schizophrenic almost, because it's like all over the place. Like, why is Google making autonomous vehicles, for example? So maybe there's this, like, depending where you're at, like early in the entrepreneurial journey, you should be more experimental, but at some point you have to pick a lane, and then at some point you have to widen back up the experimental. Do you think that's fair, or when it comes to companies?
I think so. I think that schizophrenia or some of the skepticism people have about Google's you know product suite or innovation and moonshot and that 10-20% or whatever that they give everyone is that it does feel like they're frequently outside of the lane. You use a great example of the autonomous car. Naturally we're seeing that more and more with the big tech companies. They have more money, they know what to do with, so uh, they don't mind, and they can take more shots than most, and their shots are big shots, so just seeing Amazon has done it obviously more through acquisition. But to be more direct and answer your question, I feel like and this is just speaking from firsthand experience, and I know you echo this, but um, I think you can experiment and innovate a ton, and still do that inside of a lane, and focused. And that's what's been really effective for Digible, in my opinion. And I say that to plenty of people when they ask about it, do you guys ever get bored? Do you ever want to go outside of apartments? And it's like, well, first of all, it is a big universe, but setting that aside, the progress we've made, the most dynamic things that we've done or achieved since we started the company, I believe have been because we have chosen apartments. You get way deeper, you understand the business way better, you understand way more points of view, and those are all the constructs that come together to create, I think, those 0 to 1, like 10x type products or operating protocols, etc. So that's my take on it. But I would say if I were one of those giant companies printing money, um, I might try to create driving or driverless cars myself. I
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I could see, like, like when you become that big, and maybe if you're like have saturated a category, like if we were CoStar, right? It's like, well, I mean, I could argue there's plenty more CoStar can do than they do today for apartments, but you could see how you're like, okay, if I'm trying to really increase my TAM, it shouldn't be just trying to get a little bit more of the marketing dollars or data dollars from apartments, but I need to now like look at other categories or things, versus like when you're a Digible and you have, less than 1% of the market, then you can like, you should keep going. So maybe there's something there. I forget who I was talking to the other day, but they were saying, whenever you see an exponential curve, it's not one thing that's taking off and making that hockey stick. It's a bunch of overlapping curves, like many different projects or revenue lines or whatever that are overlapping to cause the exponential. And so I could see that exact point when it comes to a big company. And so you've hit one product category, kind of maximized the effort, the reward versus the effort. Now you're moving to another category, meaning vertical even, or product category. And so then you have the Microsoft issue where Microsoft or Google, I'll use Google, but Google didn't, they bought DeepMind, whatever, like 10 years ago. And so they were set up the best to basically make OpenAI or ChatGPT, but then they had the innovator's dilemma where they didn't want to release it because it would be detrimental to their business. So then Microsoft comes in. They also didn't take a swing at like developing AI because it was expensive and costly or whatever in this capacity. And so then they had to like sort of join forces with OpenAI. And I'd heard before that there are many projects at Microsoft to shut down because they're only $100 million line items, like $100 million revenue stream. So when you're at their revenue, $100 million means nothing, and they feel like it's removing focus. So that's a lot of reasons. As a big company, you let the venture capitalist or whoever go and forge the path, and then you're willing to overpay, to basically acquire the company later, so that you don't have to be distracted. Which I guess is kind of almost like the real page model, right? Where there's not a lot of innovation happening within. They're always seeking outside. Then the challenge is how do you integrate it effortlessly, because you're assimilating all these other cultures that maybe don't fit well together.
Yeah, and it's Cinna, right? That's our guy over at
Aptly.
Appley. Yeah. Well, I think he eloquently kind of framed that and pointed it directly at RealPage because, of course, his first company or one of those companies that he was a part of was sold to RealPage, but just that, unfortunately, more often than not, even though it appears that they actively pursue smaller companies, other companies, mid stage, whatever, early stage, in order to drive innovation or acquire, new products, new tech, that in fact they usually end up shutting it down. It usually dissolves within 6 months to 2 years, and they rarely lift much, which is surprising to me. It seems like if you're going to do that, therefore it's like, why are they doing it in the first place? And not that it's a full implication here that you made, but it's like, well, they don't have that. That's not their superpower, internally. They know they still need to do that, so therefore they look outside. But then, ironically, they often, according to Senna, and I think we've seen it too, they end up killing a lot of this technology. And so,
Hmm.
is it really more often than not that competitive play, like
Hmm.
just to stamp that out before it turns into something that could actually be a viable threat? And we'll never know, like, what that, I always talk in terms of pie charts, but just how much of it was that or turned into that, versus how much tech have they actually tried to, as you said, seamlessly integrate and use to build their own like platform.
Yeah, and if I mean, we've had that conversation with different investment bankers ourselves, right? Where they say, "Hey, you guys at your scale should be looking at some of your competition or like nearby competition and consider purchasing them just in order to prevent them from getting too big or taking market share." And they were saying it didn't necessarily need to be anything that you ever wanted to assimilate. It was just like remove it from someone else assimilating. Obviously, we have not decided to go that route. Um, and I think one of our things has been, obviously like a forward-thinking collaborative industry. So that would really be breaking our BHAG, if we were to start taking that approach. So I'm glad we at least have that, I guess, direction, or have been able to set that direction so that we aren't tempted by those things.
But that depends on the circumstance, because there are a lot of companies out there um, that I think have some interesting tech, but they haven't caught with the industry for one reason or another. Not to I guess creating any conjecture here on why, but and if somebody doesn't come in and acquire them, then that tech is lost for the industry.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of tech out there, I think, that independently can't find success. But if it is paired up or acquired by the right company, it can
Hmm.
flourish. And so, even though we haven't, made that a focus of Digible's, it certainly has been coming up more for us, and I think it's exciting, it's interesting. You know, who knows where that leads us? But I definitely think we're we're opening our eyes more to the possibilities there, at least. And I think, judging by the stage that we're in, that all makes sense.
Yeah, and it maybe what you're describing there is the companies that are more of a feature versus a company. And I think I first heard that from Peter Thiel, I think. But obviously his book Zero to One was talking about being like totally innovative. But many of the innovations that have popped up are many tech innovations, many criticize of being more of a feature within a product versus its own company. And that I think maybe what you're describing would be one of those things like can you really have a feature that is self-sustaining, where instead it should really be pulled into a bigger company to. Do you get what I'm saying? Like where it should become part of some other platform instead of being standalone.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I think, yeah, I don't know if you can draw up an example, but I completely understand what you're saying. I think I guess we don't have Peter Thiel on the cast this afternoon, but I'm trying to remember, what really then distinguishes a company from a feature, because there I think are just as many examples, and I could be wrong here, that features were the birth of a company, where it's like, hey, we just came up with this one thing, this one feature that is just back to the book Hooked, where people can't get enough of it, and that is in fact the genesis of a company. Or by itself it is able to generate enough revenue to employ whatever 50, 100 people. So do you remember how he makes that distinction between a company and a feature?
I don't remember his exact like wording, but I know examples. Like one of the companies that through the pandemic that was really criticized was this company called Clubhouse. Did you hear about this?
No.
Okay, so Clubhouse was during the pandemic, it came out and basically it was like, think of it like a live podcast. So it'd be like this podcast live, and then people could enter like the waiting room and you could pull them up on stage. So it would be like, oh, we're going to invite Annie in from the audience to have a conversation with David and Reid. And that company, like within 1 year, went to a $4 billion. It went from startup idea to $4 billion valuation within 1 year, and it was all because people were migrating to it. But very quickly, Twitter released Twitter Spaces, Spotify released their, I forget what their features called, but some live thing, and basically Clubhouse got crushed because it was like you don't need a standalone app to like basically have a live podcast where you might bring in an audience member, and then it just becomes a podcast later. You might as well just be part of a podcast app like Spotify, and then you can bring you can do the live broadcast, and then it becomes a podcast afterwards. So that was an example of one of the more, I guess, recent features, if you will, meaning doing a live podcast that really should have just been part of the Spotify platform.
Yeah, that definitely helps. As you were talking through it, because I know we had the conversation, I don't know if we ever did on the podcast, but just about Amazon's one click, and how
Yeah.
transformative that was, and they patented and got so much mileage out of it. But it wouldn't have built a company. It was a, yeah, like I said, transformative feature, but now that we take for granted with so many other Shopify, et cetera, whatever, e-commerce applications. And yeah, it would be short-lived if that's all you could hang your hat on. So I guess it's thinking more in terms of the difference between function and feature, because if you have a platform that delivers a specific function, like e-commerce, i.e. Amazon, that obviously can build a company or create a company. But, the one feature of a one click within that function is not going to create a company.
That's an excellent example. I mean, the only reason that that worked is because they patented it and they held on to it until the patent expired, right? But to your point, like if it would have been its own company, maybe people would have bought it, but then as soon as the patent expires, like you get crushed because it's such an easy piece of code to, yeah, so obvious. The other thing that strikes me, I'll say there's always folks that disprove the rule, right? And so Calendly is one of those that disproves the rule for me. When Calendly launched, all investors were like, why the hell should Calendly exist? Like, what if Google just puts in their own scheduling option, for someone to book on your calendar? And sure enough, Google released its own feature where you can like say, here's the time that you can book on Reid's calendar. And yet Calendly is a freaking juggernaut right now. Like, and part of that I think is because the feature was implemented so poorly with Google itself, Google Calendar versus Calendly. But it just goes to show like there are contrarians that can still win out, even though it seems like it should just be a feature of your calendar app.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's fair to say those are the exceptions. I think what you might discover, though, and I don't know how you would actually verify this, but that there's a lot of companies that have developed features that they are essentially licensing, meaning that they get royalties on
Mm-hmm.
certain sticky features that are transferable, right? It's like you mentioned the Calendly. I'm not saying that's the right example, but where you've created a snippet of code, you have actually trademarked it or gotten a patent, and all sorts of people are using it. But you're not a company. You're just you basically
Mm-hmm.
license some code or technology, and you make a fortune off of it, which seems pretty cool to
Mm-hmm.
me. That could be one of the better ways to go at it, right?
Yeah, if anything, that reminds me of like the patent trolls that just like submit all this stuff and try to like get money from the
Mhm.
big but I don't know that there's a patent troll.com or something, right? Where it's like, all right, we have 1,000 patents and all we do. I mean, obviously that's a terrible, I view that as a terrible company because that's more of like you're trying to like limit innovation. Well, bring
Totally.
it back to essentialism. What then do you take personally, or are you going to take from essentialism versus the random walk approach? Because obviously I think there's value in both perspectives, but you have to find your right place on that scale.
Well, I think it is an active exercise, topical, however you want to put that, that you have to practice really daily on the essentialism for for you to take anything from it. It doesn't mean that your whole life now is consumed with that, philosophy, but I have tried to make it an active part of my thought process throughout the day, especially when I'm confronted, of course, as you are, with lots of decisions. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they're big. But ask myself, have I thought through, or have I been exposed to lots of different kind of perspectives or elements of this, so that I can then narrow in and hopefully make a good decision. That's more decision making, though. It's not the kind of profound, I guess, message that he was giving about your contribution to life, that also is part of it. So I think he offers up, here's how you can kind of apply this at the workplace as a business owner. But then, towards the end, he really hammers home, like, in life, if you practice this, you'll have far better chance of making, meaningful contributions. And so from that standpoint, I feel like in a way I'm on that track, and you're on it with me. At least this stage of our life, right? Is, we did create this company. It has definitely garnered all of our focus, all of our attention. And even though there's maybe some lack of essentialism that's happened up to this point, and still will happen, ultimately, all our eggs are in this basket. And I think we are seeing the benefits of that, focus. And then there's other areas I don't mind sharing, certainly related to my family and my kids, and, some of the things that we've been hit with, like with diabetes, that I look forward to pouring in more essentialism, more focus, and hope that drives, some of those bigger contributions. On the exploratory side, so that kind of covers off on how I'm thinking about essentialism, trying to borrow from that and apply that. But that doesn't, I don't feel like that's as hard for me. I'm a pretty curious person, and I don't feel like I'm stopping that from happening. In fact, I'm probably generating a lot of that for others around me. um I think you're somebody that has brought that to me, which I appreciate, whether it's in the form of books or just thought, different thoughts and ideas. So I look forward to, I'll just say, more of that random walk coming to me, instead of me going out there trying to find it, or generate it myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think the way I want to orient, and this is at risk of Jordan, Chelsea's dad, getting upset at me for not taking his advice, but
Earmuffs,
um,
Jordan.
yeah, the I'm thinking about I love this sort of ties to Dan Martell and how he says like, split plan your year in advance about those pillars that you want to hit and blah blah blah. And then I'm combining it with Jim Collins. So Jim Collins, you might remember, but he talks how he journals his time for every hour of the day, and he has a goal for the year. And I just pulled it up so I could have it here, where he divides it into he wants 50% of his time to be creative, 30% to be teaching, and 20% random stuff like other things that need to get done. And so, as you and I, we talk a lot about as we hire more of those senior leaders or specialty positions or what have you, strategic places, that will free us up as EOS recommends. And so then we spend 50% of our time on thought leadership, for example, or like 20% of our time on discovery. But just having, as you like to say, directionally an idea of which buckets do we want to hit, and then just making sure that our calendar sort of gets aligned in those ways. That way at least we're deliberate about it, and hopefully we can emotionally let go to be like, well, yes, I'm only spending 5% of my time networking, but that's the bar I set for myself.
Yeah, I love that idea and maybe practice, I'll say, of Jim Collins, and how you could, weave that into your own universe. Um, I struggle with it personally and openly. A lot of the behavioral tests that I've taken over my career, psychological tests, anytime anything related to, I'm going to call it admin, pops up, I'm like on the negative spectrum, if it's possible, negative side of that score. So the journaling just, it's not that it
Yes.
terrifies me, but just hearing you say that stresses me out. But I also wouldn't want to not know, that would be almost as frustrating for me, whether I'm, applying, this kind of discipline or process. And that's what, you, before we got on, you had mentioned, is should we bring up again flow, or any of those learnings from Daniel Pink's book. And I never will try to pronounce that author of, the actual author of flow. I forget what country he's from, and all I'm saying is I would butcher the crap out of it. That's all. But anyways, Daniel Pink says one of the best things you can do for your organization and maybe for yourself, if certainly if you're, an entrepreneur, but is to do audits of autonomy and flow. And so throughout the week, you can have those check-ins. The autonomy, I don't know, it needs to be as frequent, but where you survey your employees, and on that flow piece, which is, AKA engagement, he recommends, as much as 40 times in the span of just a week, where you go through kind of a very simple process of asking yourself, how engaged do I feel? How meaningful is the work that I'm doing? How challenged do I feel, etc. And that will ultimately tell you in a more honest way how much flow you really do have in your life, at your job. And so I'm connecting this to the Jim Collins like 50-30-20 rule. That's what I like about it, is if you don't do that stuff, one way or another, you can't really be that effective, right? Because you don't know. It would all be gut instinct, and we know how many false positives, I'll say, there are when you just try and use your general memory. So, I'm just airing that out because that's something I would have to sort through or figure out, is
Yeah.
how can I kind of check in with myself, but in a way that doesn't completely stress me out. Cause like the frequent journaling is just, I know
Yeah.
myself. I would not do that. I would hate that.
Same here. I think the only way I could make it work for myself is as we onboard the EA, that it becomes like a color coded like structure right on my calendar. And then I just pull it that way to be like, yep, okay, red means thought time or something. And I think that would help me too, because then I would actually, like, if I had deep thought on my calendar blocked off, I would actually do it. Because I'm like, it's getting assigned to me. So I think that's the only way it's going to end up working for me, because I'm with you on the admin. I just am not. That's just back to essential. I just don't view that as like a high priority. you know.
Well, yeah, and if it creates if it creates stress, I mean, that's the
Yeah.
last thing you want to do. Even if there is some value to taking that approach. Um, I don't know what drop you were going to play, but I do want you to share what you attempted to do when I spaced out there, and then I'm going to recommend that you come up with some sort of, I don't know if you pull it from a song or something, because it'd be too cliche if you did like Jeopardy theme song in the background
That's
whenever I have.
exactly what I was going to look up just now.
Yeah, see, that's too easy. You're gonna have to come up with something better than that. But you can use that as a placeholder until you do find something better. Um,
That's what I tried to play because I couldn't find crickets, so all I had was laughing. I had cheering, but I was like, that didn't seem to apply. So
yeah, I think the laughing's pretty good. It's also a little
okay,
harsh, but
yeah,
I can take it.
yeah. All right. Well, this was good. I enjoyed it, and I think I've got my head a little bit more wrapped around how I'll approach it in the near term. But I always enjoy these conversations where we have these conflicting recommendations from whether it's a book or an interview or something, and then trying to sort it out. Like, how do I want to apply this? Because you could, as we've talked about, you can get paralyzed by just you consume this material and you got to find out what works for you.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of, I'll call it, competing, direction or suggestions that come from these, and um, you do have to make decisions, right? Back to essentialism, funny enough, but
Hmm.
and Jim Collins, I'll squeeze both of those in, where it's like you got to commit, make a decision and commit. So yeah, good stuff. I think I'm just going to put our listeners on notice here. If you haven't listened to Andrew Huberman, you need to, not just because he's extremely bright and interesting, but I have a feeling I'm going to be offering a lot more references. So, it's been the Collins, Sinek, Grant, blah, 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 train for a while, but now, yeah, there's going to be some Huberman sprinkled in here.
Yeah, we're moving into the season of Huberman for Reid.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of
Yeah.
putting it.
All right, cool. Well, we'll see you guys next time.